1. Okay, everybody, welcome back. I have my Chik-Fil-A coffee, and joining me is Father Gregory Pine, and we're going to talk about predestination. And this is part 2 of a conversation we started a week or two ago. I will probably stitch them together and release them at the same time. The good news, though, is now that I have my coffee, Father Gregory, I'm actually awake. And last conversation, I just wasn't awake. I'm sorry. I just was not awake for that conversation. So thank you for doing the heavy lifting in that previous episode. I appreciate it.
Quick question for you. Is that actually Chik-Fil-A coffee?
It is, because they are doing free coffee month. So you can just roll right up, at least to the local one, and just, so I went to 6:30 Mass this morning. Very beautiful.
Nice.
And there's a Chik-Fil-A just right down the street. So I'm like, I'm going to go grab my free coffee.
Wow. So here's the thing. I don't mean to say something controversial, but I like Chik-Fil-A. I like Chik-Fil-A a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But I do not like Chik-Fil-A coffee at all. Like, one can say many things about many things, and I don't want to, upset any of your listeners by just going straight for the jugular, but I really don't like Chik-Fil-A coffee. Okay. It's got like that. It tastes like tree bark and a fart. Which is like a killer combo as far as I'm concerned. Because I'm fine with like tree bark tasting coffee. I think chicory coffee often tastes a little bit tree barky, but it's got like that good bitter.
Right.
This has like a kind of like old shoe bitter to it.
Yes. Yeah. So I didn't know we were going to start off on such a contentious issue before we even got to predestination. But I mean, let's go. There is no doubt in my mind that this is trash coffee.
Okay.
But there is there's a certain trash coffee that still has an appeal to me. I actually call it church coffee, right? Like church coffee is generally trash coffee. But there's another kind of trash coffee that I can't stand, and I would call that Starbucks.
Ooh.
Yeah. So like it's trash coffee that tries to pretend like it's not trash coffee, right? Whereas I think Chik-Fil-A fully understands this is just hot bean water, right? Like it's just, and it's gonna get you lit, and that's gonna be the end of it. So for me, maybe there's a little more mortification benefit to drinking this stuff. It's like the middle ground between like giving up my coffee. I'll just give up good coffee. I don't know. Maybe that's just rationalization, but there's my return fire.
No, I don't know that I disagree with what you said. I haven't had Starbucks coffee in a long, long time. And I forget what it tastes like. I know that they have many coffees, but I've heard that like as a way by which to preserve their corporate brand, they like for their coffees to have a similar taste profile. And apparently one of the most effective ways to ensure that your coffees have a similar taste profile is to over roast the beans to kind of burn them a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's true. I've heard that. People say all kinds of things. But if that were the case, I could see you hating on Starbucks coffee. I think like, I don't know, it's like wine or whiskey. You have to have acquired the palate in order to distinguish among things that are good, bad, or indifferent. And when it comes to coffees, I can't pick up on a lot of the tasting notes that your barista will tell you ought to be able to discern when he pours you a little, cup. There are a lot of like these cool hipster spots in Louisville, Kentucky, which was where I was last assigned. I used to go and they'd like make you a pour over and they'd tell you everything that you were supposed to experience. And I'd be like,
yep.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to experience any of that. And it wasn't because I have like a cultivated sense of like American, I don't know, like anti-aristocratic feelings towards coffee. Because I'd love to be able to pick up those notes. I can't really.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What I can taste is tree bark and dirt and energy. But I just find that some taste more tree barky dirty and some taste more less bad.
Yeah.
So,
agreed. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's. I mean, if you read that on the internet about Starbucks, it's almost certainly true. And I would agree with that because I've tried. There's obviously a Starbucks. There's like 5 Starbucks right by me. And I've tried to go through their different, their light and their dark, and they all just, I remember I even got a shot of espresso one time and I couldn't finish it. And I'm pretty good about finishing stuff I don't like. It's just, I'm with you too. Like, I think, here's a word that I take from H.L. Mencken. I think I'm pretty ambibulous. I like all types of beverages. I like beer. I like wine. I like whiskey. I like soda. And I think I'm like decent enough to tell like good from bad. I don't think I'm good enough to tell if it's even a true thing to tell like the good from like the truly phenomenal, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like I think I can tell a good from bad wine, but there's some of these, alleged super tasters, and I have no doubt that these people exist, but it's certainly not me. Like once you get above a certain threshold, I can't tell the difference, anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I feel like I can tell the difference between good and great grape juice, right? Because it's a very small gap.
Right.
But when it's a wider spectrum, then I feel like you actually have to know what you're doing, which I
Mm-hmm.
don't. Yeah.
Cool. All right, predestination.
You ready?
Yeah. Let's do it. So,
Okay.
why don't we try and just give a quick recap or summary of our previous conversation? Because at first it seemed like we were disagreeing on some things, but then as we moved along, it seems like okay, maybe we don't disagree substantially, maybe just superficially or even semantically. So I want to explore that a little bit more, and I also thought maybe it'd be helpful to explore just like certain points or issues rather than explore from schools or camps, if that makes sense. Because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you hear things like, oh, here's the Banyesian position or the harder Thomist, and here's the softer Thomist. And I think you can, or a Molinist position, or whatever. And I think that there's just a lot of, I guess, assumptions that will often be smuggled into the conversation that aren't thoroughly vetted, which can obscure a number of the issues. How does that procedure sound for you, Father
That
Gregory?
that sounds groovy.
All right. So recap us. Where did we cover? Where did we leave off? Do you remember?
I remember some of what we said. As to whether it will count as a good recap, I leave that for the listener to discern. So we're talking about predestination, right? Predestination is just a kind of application of the doctrine of divine providence. So God knows, and God doesn't know like we know, right? When we know something, we discover that it is the case, and our minds are shaped by that reality. But when God knows something, he knows it kind of from the opposite direction. It is by virtue of God's knowing it. So God's knowledge is creative. So God, in considering himself, holds together all of the different ways in which created things can share in his divine life. So God only has the one thought, and that thought is of himself. But in that thought is pre-contained, to speak somewhat, I don't know, cutely, is pre-contained all of the different ways in which God's divine life can be limited, I suppose, is one way of describing it. And we call those the divine ideas. And to some of those ideas, God conjoins his will. Whenever we describe it in these ways, it sounds like a process is happening, or it sounds like there are, things that God is sorting out
Right.
or
Moving through
choosing amongst.
sequentially or something like that. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, but this all kind of transpires, as it were, in the simplicity of God's eternity. So God conjoins his will to some of those ideas, and those things are right. So he conjoined his will to this. Well, I want to speak about substances in the strict sense. I just went for a run, right? So he conjoined his will to the tree that I passed by on the footpath. He conjoined his will to the river that coursed, like from north to south. He conjoined his will to, you get it, ... a variety of things. And so God knows all of those things creatively and causally. He causes them to be, he causes them to act, like he imparts to them their proper agency. And their agency as either free or as, kind of like bound by their nature. So like rocks can't but be rocky, but human beings can choose freely. So he causes each thing to act in a way proper to each, right? And as a result of which, like God's knowledge embraces every aspect of that being. So some beings, they kind of have what it is to be in an instant, right? So like angels only really make one choice, and then they reap forever the harvest of that choice. Whereas we live in the stream of time. So we never possess ourselves wholly and entirely in any one moment. Rather, we're coming into possession of ourselves. But God makes us to be in that way. He makes us to cause in that way, but not in such a way as to be limited by the nature of our being and causing. So God knows us, loves us, causes us eternally in a certain sense, right? And part of God's knowing and loving of us is knowing and loving our destiny. All right. And if we go to heaven, it will not have been by our natural resources. It will have been by the fact, or by virtue of the fact, that God gave us the grace to attain to that height. And if we go to hell, it will have been by our choice. But God will confirm us in that choice and will, choose our punishment. So God knows, right, what it is that we are bound for. And he causes us to proceed towards that end freely. So we're not determined, right? We have free will. That free will is a fruit of God causing us to be agents in the manner proper to what we are, right? But also, like God knows how things transpire because he's causing them to be in the course of time from his eternity. And that plan whereby one comes to heaven is just what we mean by predestination.
Yes.
So that's like the big ticket item, I suppose. That's like the 30,000-foot view zoomed in to the perspective of the individual soul. But
Beautiful.
Predestination, being a thorny issue, has difficult applications, or when applied, in particular cases, it proves difficult to parse. And we were talking specifically about the Blessed Virgin Mary. So what does it mean for her to be predestined? Because she participates in the redemption in peculiar fashion, right? So she is preserved from sin rather than liberated from sin, right? And she's also proposed to us as a model. So it's important that she have a kind of solidarity with sinful humanity, because if not, then she somehow escapes the universal mediation of salvation, as won for us by the Lord Jesus Christ, or she escapes this idea of exemplarity, right? She is not really a good model for us if she cannot be sympathized with. So I think those were like the big issue. And obviously we drilled down on a variety of points, but those are the big things on the table.
Good. Yes. Excellent. So we will just take them one by one, and just maybe trot out a couple of different points of apparent tension. And I say apparent tension because I think these tensions can be resolved. If not, if the mystery can at least be fully eliminated, I think we can at least move in a direction that is generally helpful. That's where I'm at on the predestination thing. Is I think there will always be some element of mystery, of course, just due to God's being infinitely higher than us in virtually every respect. But I think we can do some things that might help to alleviate some of the alleged tensions. I want to circle back to Mary in a little bit, because to me she is critical in this, and we need to treat Mary because I think we do need and want to preserve her as a model. And there are some positions that some people take. I'm not going to put in any camp because we're going to avoid that. Which I think would make it difficult for Mary to still be our model, and I want to avoid that if that's possible. So here's one thing I want to pick your mind about, and this is often a general response, and obviously the predestination is pretty entangled with the problem of evil, right? And it's not just evil and suffering in general, but also the potential eternal separation that people can have from God, right? Which is hell. And the permission of that, and God's permission of sin, generally why God allows sin and suffering and evil into the world. And it's sometimes suggested that God will permit a certain amount of evil or suffering into the world because the world has some greater number of goods that might have otherwise not been available if God didn't allow. And we can talk about what we mean about allow and permission here in a minute. Some suffering, some evil, right? Now, what are the ones that people commonly trot out? Things like compassion, forgiveness, mercy, empathy, maybe the atonement itself, the incarnation itself. What I want to say to that is it's either incomplete, out of order, or wrong in a sense, right? And my worry with that general response is that it can make God out to be something of a utilitarian, right? And obviously we don't think that God is a utilitarian. It wouldn't even make sense for God to be a utilitarian in the sense that we are. But I think the problem with this type of response to both the problem of evil and predestination in general is that it's as if like God were aiming for some type of let's say aesthetic portrait of the universe, right? That might not otherwise have been possible without some apparent dark spots. Now, I think it's true that God can create that aesthetic portrait and bring greater goods out of sin and evil. Obviously, I totally believe that, and that is the case. However, I think I would want to say it's incomplete insofar as that's not God's original aim. And we have to be careful here because, again, we're not thinking that there's like a sequence of thoughts for God. So just, hang a lantern on that. But what I want to say is this, actually, that the possibility of evil is more and primarily related to God wanting interpersonal relationships and love. And I think that is the proper way to focus this first general response. Now, why do I say that? If God is going to have or aim for interpersonal relationship, friendships, communion, and love, he's going to have to create other free creatures, because love requires the uniting of two wills, right? The free uniting of two wills. Now, I think it's also going to be the case out of metaphysical necessity that if God is going to create any free creature, it's going to be metaphysically a fallible free creature. And the reason for that is because only God is his own rule, right? Only God is goodness itself, being itself. So any other free creature that God creates, it's always going to have to look to something beyond itself for that rule, for the consideration of the moral rule, which means it could always not look at the rule, could always not consider the rule, perform some action where the rule should have applied, and then that's where the privation comes in, right? Where something's missing from the order of being that should have been there. It's an objective falsehood, as Lonergan would call it, right? That's what sin is. So what I want to say first is that the seeking of friendships, love, and communion, I think entails that God has to run the risk, as it were, for the possibility of sin. Now, of course, we believe that God could override our fallibility, right? As we believe certain exception cases may have been made. But, and this, I think, goes back to our previous conversation, and I'll shut up here in a minute, right? I don't think it's always useful in these conversations to think about just what God could do in his absolute power versus thinking about what God would do in relation to his ordained power, right? And we talked about last time that God, in the general run, governs things according to their mode of being, right? That he saves natures. He doesn't destroy them or make complete nonsense of them, in the same sense that while it might be good for God to perform miracles here and there, it would seem to be something of a fallacy of composition if we thought it would be good that God just perform miracles all the time, if we can even make sense of that. Same thing I want to say with human beings. Yes, could God make exception cases, override our natural fallibility? Certainly, I think in his absolute power, he could do that. But in his ordained power, same thing, I think, would be something of a composition fallacy to suggest that it would be good overall if God did that for everyone. And then that sin might actually occur, right? And there's a difference between God willing some sort of circumstances where sin might actually occur versus it inevitably or infallibly occurring. I don't think we want to say that. But the fact that it did occur, that God can then bring about those other greater goods like compassion, forgiveness, mercy, empathy, the atonement. That's the way I want to think about it. That seems better to me. And I just threw a whole bunch of stuff at you. I'm sorry to do that again. I always do this, right? What are your thoughts on all that opening gambit?
Yeah, I have a few. Maybe we can just break them up and just chat them through.
Mm-hmm.
The first one concerns what is God doing in creating the universe. I think that a lot of us just have to acknowledge at the outset that we think about this in kind of like utilitarian or Leibnizian fashion. So we think of it as if God were almost responsible for creating the best possible world, or God were responsible for bringing about the greatest imaginable good. But that's not the case. God is not responsible for anything of that sort, right? So you made a suggestion, God is not normed by a higher standard. So God cannot but do what is good because such is his nature. Whereas in the case of free, fallible creatures, we can do wrong because we can fail with regard to the standard who is God himself. So when you think about it, like when God creates the universe, God sets it up both in its kind of present state, but also he sets the terms for its flourishing, right? So there's no standard, there's no blueprint. Like, if you are God and if you are going to create a world, you should do it according to these, prefabbed plans.
Right. He's not
No,
looking to some platonic realm of forms, for example, right? Yeah.
no, God, the type, as it were, for God's creation of the universe is himself. It's his own abundance. And we are the testimony to that divine abundance. For what reason? For the glory of God, right? Because we are afforded a share in participating in his divine life. And he creates a bewildering variety of creatures, so that in our contemplation of each thing in its place and in its time, and in the ecosystematic harmony that obtains among those individual things, some of which are agents, each of which has its own kind of proper causality, we might rise to the knowledge of God, who is good and who has created that we might know him to be good. So God is not about making the best possible world, right? Nor is God, subject to some optimization scheme. God does what he does because he's good, right? Could God have done things better? According to a certain standard, yes. But like, from whence the standard, I suppose.
He could always add one more Chick-fil-A, right?
He could always add one more Chick-fil-A. You could add to the excellence of the things, both extensively, like adding another Chick-fil-A, or intensively. Chick-fil-A's coffee could be better.
See, we're good at making those connections, right?
You've got to.
Mhm.
Also, their waffle fries could last longer than 12 minutes.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Or God could have set it up that our commute was a little bit shorter from home to Chick-fil-A, right? Mm-hmm.
That's right. Yeah. You didn't think it was a problem when you dined in, but now that everyone has to dine out, it's a real crisis that the waffle fry, it just doesn't last. It doesn't hold up.
Mm-hmm.
You have to ask for them well done. Some places they'll tell you we don't do that. Other places they will do it for you. And even still, limited lifeline. So I think that's the first thing. When you were talking, like this aesthetic idea. All right. So God, I think, and this came up in an earlier conversation that we had. God should not be conceived of as a moral agent like we are moral agents. As to whether or not he is a moral agent, that's a contentious question, right? Some say yes, some say no. They have different reasons for saying yes and no. At the end of the day, kind of God is subject to himself, right? So God is preeminently moral because the eternal law is the standard for all moral, acts and virtues, as it were, right? So God is preeminently moral, but he's moral in a way that exceeds the compass of our minds, right? So he's not moral in the way that we are moral. He is moral in a way that transcends and gives meaning and shape to our morality. So when we talk about the problem of evil, we need to keep this in mind, certainly as it circumscribes the problem of predilection and predestination. God is not responsible for saving everyone, which is a terrible thing to say out loud, but you need to state it, right? And I think you need to clarify it so it doesn't sound like the type of thought which sends one down the contemplation of his perdition, right? But that's not the point, right? God is in a certain sense bound by his own nature, right? He's bound by his own generosity, but he's not bound by creation, right? He just isn't. So maybe we'll just, I don't know if you want to just keep plugging through things, but we can chat through that.
Yeah, no, this is great. Yeah. So whether God is a moral agent, right. So yeah, definitely, like, there's some Thomists like Brian Davies who would say, no, that's just a huge category mistake. Right. And there's others who saying, well, yeah, maybe he kind of is. I think we can set that to one side. And I think your articulation is absolutely right, that God is his own moral rule. There are obvious constraints on God, but they're constraints that are just constraints of being perfect being itself, right? So the idea that, as Descartes would suggest, that God could lie or something like that, that is a category mistake, right? That's thinking that God is, that would be both against God's absolute power and ordained power when you understand who and what God is. And that's not a defect of God, right? That's not a limitation. It's something that follows from God's perfections. So sometimes people can, I think, fall for what are just oftentimes like tricks of language and stuff like this. But yeah, you're right. God is his own rule, right? So even if we think of God as moral, we have to, do it as good metaphysicians analogically, something like that, right? There are, of course, people who think we can have. Yeah, so that's a good question, right? Does that mean, even if we want to say that God isn't a moral agent, we certainly don't mean that God isn't good, because God is the supreme good. So let's make sure we're not making that conflation. But does that mean that we can have no moral expectations of God? That's another, I think that's the more interesting question, right? Even if we don't think that God is a moral agent, certainly not like we are, can we still have certain moral expectations of God? And I want to say yes. I want to say yes to that to a certain degree or up to a certain point. And I'll give you an example. I think that we can have a moral expectation of God to the extent that something like a Calvinist double predestination is false, right? And decidedly false. That it would be against God's nature to have some, arbitrary selection where God is directly responsible. So even if he isn't responsible to save everybody, I think we can hold an expectation that he wouldn't directly send somebody, be the cause of somebody's sin, right? And be the direct or even, accidental cause, right? I think we want to be careful about that, of their sin, of sending them to hell either. What would be an example of this? Yeah, aside from just the crude one of saying that God just directly causes sin, which I think on a metaphysical analysis wouldn't make sense. I think also something like, here's one thing I also wouldn't want to affirm, that God would drop us out of the moral good, if that makes sense, right? A sort of non-conservation in the moral good. That seems wrong to me in the same sense that God would just annihilate the world. Is it within God's absolute power? Yes. But it seems like it is not in accord with God's goodness, wisdom, or justice at that point. So in the same sense that we can be confident and have good expectations that God wouldn't just blip the world out of existence, he wouldn't just drop somebody arbitrarily out of the moral good, such that even if he isn't the direct cause of sin, he's still the accidental or indirect cause of sin in that sense. And that person, ultimately going to hell. So that would be an expectation to me where I would want to resist that. And I want to say, no, that isn't the case. The who is ultimately and directly responsible for sin, that has to be on the creature's side. And that's where a lot of this debate gets issue and murky. But I guess my general point, and what I'm throwing back your way, is the idea of whatever else we want to say about God being a moral agent, can we still hold some moral expectations of God? And what do you think of the ones that I've just trotted out?
Yeah. So you listed a few divine attributes which give reason for us to believe that we can have some expectations, and you cited justice, love, and wisdom, which is significant because those are all like pure perfections, right? And they are ways that we participate God as a natural exemplar. So I read an article that you shared with me, or you suggested to me, by a guy named John Minert, who teaches in Baton Rouge, and published this article in like 2018 in the Thomist. And it's adjudicating the debate between Shanley and Davies on whether or not God is a moral agent. But he draws a distinction between or among the different ways in which God is an exemplar. And whenever we talk about moral perfections, there are some which, it would be more or less proper to speak of them as abiding in God. So he says, like commutative justice, for instance, commutative justice, which establishes strict equality between two parties. He says that's just not in God, like period, right? And then he cites some other virtues like faith, okay, the evidence of the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. It's not really in God, right? Why? Well, because God sees himself, right? So God has no need for faith. God sees all things. He holds them together all in one glance. But there are certain aspects of the virtue of faith which do abide in God. And so he says, like, kind of like metaphorically, we can say that God is the exemplar, the intellectual, metaphorical exemplar of these things. And then he ascends the ranks and says, like, okay, there are other things which are more properly said of God, but they're not in God, right, in the strict sense, but they kind of abide in God more thoroughly, as it were. For these, he serves as the analogical intellectual exemplar. I'm kind of being hazy on the details of that one because I just read the article and I don't know that I actually retained the difference too terribly well. But then he says there are certain things for which God is just the natural exemplar. Okay, so it's not that like the divine idea is the thing on which we're patterned. It's just that we're just patterned on God. Okay. And here he cites those kind of pure perfections, as it were, which are true of the divine essence, So wisdom, justice, love, things like that. Okay. So I think I just want to focus on wisdom. This would be a distinction between the Thomistic tradition, in which you and I work, and then the nominalist tradition. So the nominalist tradition is a lot more agnostic about what we can know of God. And it affirms certain things with respect to God that really do hinge upon God having an entirely or wholly undetermined will. So here things, they're often cited out of context. They're often cited super unsympathetically, but like William of Ockham will say that God could make it praiseworthy for you to curse him, right? Because by his potentia absoluta, he could decree that such a thing were virtuous. Whereas in the Thomist tradition, this is insane, right? Because God is wise, right? And it's discordant with God's nature that such a thing obtain, because God's very nature is to be, and there's no being, there's no sense in that notion just proposed. So I think that, yeah, in a certain sense, we can have moral expectations of God, or we can reason about God and his interaction with creation because he is wise, right? And there's a real analogical association between wisdom as we know it, this side of eternity, and wisdom as it subsists in God, as it is God, okay? So insofar as we can have access to that, which I think we can have some access to it, then I think we can have moral expectations. All of that, though, comes with a real heavy apophatic note, which word apophatic means a kind of like, it appertains to a theological tradition which is very nervous about making affirmations about God, because it recognizes that for everything that we say of God, it's more untrue than it is true. Mm-hmm. So whenever we affirm something of God, we're effectively saying, okay, like when we say God is good, we're saying, on the one hand, God is the cause of goodness. Okay, good. We're also saying that God is not like the goodness that we encounter this side of eternity, but that God is good in a supereminent or preeminent way, right? So this would be the threefold way, the triplex via of Pseudo-Dionysius, the kind of Neoplatonian tradition. So we need to sprinkle in some agnosticism. We need to sprinkle in some apophaticism. But that is to say, too, that, we can know something about God, both naturally, right? And as he reveals himself to be, so by faith. So those would be other things you could advance.
Right. Yeah. So always good reminders that good metaphysicians, we proceed predominantly analogically and apophatically, right? So it's a little, be a little bit, don't want to be too quick on the trigger there. I 100% agree. That's why I said, like, to a degree, to a threshold. I think an example maybe of going too far, and I don't think we want to wade into this. We could do a future episode on this. I'm looking towards his book right now, David Bentley Hart. He's got a book on universalism, right? And he bases part of his argument. He's got a series of arguments on a very strong moral expectation that God, as the absolute good, not only could but would save all. So he's adamant about that, right? And I would say, no, that's going too far. At least not without other considerations that we need to get into. But that would be somebody who is, I think David Bentley Hart would probably resist the term of being a Thomist, but I would argue he is broadly Thomistic, right? He has a robust sense of divine universal causality. He tends to look at the human person through, I would say, a broadly Thomistic lens. I think there's certain things he doesn't deal with that maybe we could get into, or he doesn't deal with them adequately, like the postmortem fixity of the soul, which I think is a big thing that needs to be factored into predestination considerations. But all right, let's just bracket that off. I'm just using him as an example as somebody who would go with us to an extent, but maybe would go further than either of us would want to go on the side of moral expectations. So I guess my moral expectations would be there's a certain threshold beyond which I wouldn't want to fall below. Whereas I think, and I think that's reasonable, like the idea that God would have just blipped the world out of existence or dropped somebody out of the moral good arbitrarily. That seems like a reasonable expectation. I hope it's true, because I don't want to be walking around every 5 minutes thinking God's just going to poof the world, right? That would make me a little neurotic, to say the least. But I don't know if I have the confidence or the clarity to say, forget about this whole trying to make myself holy business. God's going to get me to heaven one way or another, right? And fall into the sin of presumption there. I don't know if you just have any general remarks on that. Otherwise, I could keep going on to the next point.
Yeah, no, I think a good
Cool.
standard for the healing and elevating of reasonable discourse is just how God reveals himself, right? So like in the letter of James, we hear, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. It seems like there's a place there for human volition. It seems like sanctity is something for which we need to strive, and as a result of which we should strive for it, right? Whereas what you describe, with like the sin of presumption would negate a lot of, like the revelation of sacred scripture and how that scripture has been received in the church's tradition and preached in the church's sacramental life and clarified in the church's magisterium. So I think that with this stuff too, faith has a way by which of, clarifying, healing and elevating the operation of reason. And so it's not like cheating or skipping to the answer key to appeal to faith discourse. It gives you a good and sane indication as to, what the bounds are. So if something just doesn't square with revelation, then you can have some assurance that you've probably thought a wrong. And then you can go back and discern the reasons for which. So like universalism, for instance, I think that's the contrary is taught, it seems to me, very clearly in scripture. Wide is the way that leads to destruction, narrow the way that leads to life. The parable of Divis and Lazarus, there's an unbridgeable chasm between, between Divis and Lazarus. Divis, who's in hell, it seems, Sheol, Hades, whatever, and then Lazarus, who's in the bosom of Abraham, even if only by anticipation of the full revelation of heaven. But yeah, there seems to be some pretty straightforward home run type exegetical moves. Matthew 25, the separating of the sheep and the goats on the Lord's right and left, respectively. The criterion for which is whether or not they love the Lord in both God and neighbor. So it seems like what we do in this life matters. And it seems like God gives us the wherewithal whereby to proceed to him, or he gives us the graces that are prevenient to justification at the very least, graces that are sufficient, to use later scholastic terminology. And if you were to just kind of fall afoul or run athwart of that tradition by the operation of reason, it would just make me really nervous, I suppose. So yeah, I think the expectations that we have are circumscribed by the revelation of sacred scripture and the church's tradition.
Right, and it goes back to what we talked about last time of part of what makes the discourse around predestination so fun, but also nerve-wracking, is that you have to balance so many different things, right? We have to think metaphysically. We have to consider philosophical anthropology. We have to consider revelation. We have to consider tradition. And if you get off in one area, you'll have to make compensations and typically further mistakes in another area. So it's an exceedingly difficult, exceedingly delicate, and especially difficult project, which is why it's both fun and nerve-wracking to contemplate. Okay, so I guess part of what I'm getting at then of what I want to affirm is something like a free will defense, but it's not a free will defense as is typically used in, I would say, apologetic projects. It's more of a free will exploration, I would say, of part of to explain not just the whole mystery of predestination, but evil itself, right? That there are, and we talked about this before, right? Of like freedom for excellence, which is true, right? We believe our terminal freedom, God willing, if we get to heaven, will be a freedom where we are permanently fixed on the good of God, right? We'll still be able to choose between finite particular goods, presumably, right? But our final locked on destination is set. It's upheld by, of course, a supernatural gift that God gives us. But there's also, our lower power of freedom. And I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both ends. So we have our terminal freedom. We do have freedom of choice, which comes with being naturally fallible beings, right? The ability to choose X or not X. And that's where I think the distinction between God's absolute power and ordained power. It seems like God wants us to reach in the general run of things, right? Our terminal freedom through our freedom of choice. Because that is who we are, right? That's in accord with our natures. So I would want to resist often too quick of a dismissal of that admittedly lesser noble power of freedom that we have as we strive towards that terminal freedom. I don't know if that's a major point, but I think it's worth considering, and it's something that I think is just integral to human nature.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the point of God made this world and not another one.
Mhm.
So, you showed some nervousness to affirm a free will defense because you sensed what I was thinking over here, right? So typically in the Thomistic tradition, one would not advance a free will defense because of, because of the theology of grace,
Right.
which kind of undergirds it, right? So one would affirm within the kind of Bonniesian tradition that God, gives grace in such a way that it's intrinsically efficacious whilst being resistible.
Mhm.
So it doesn't override your freedom, as it were, but it has its effect. So one can be moved or made to choose freely in a way that is more interior to himself than his own actions, as it were, right? By God's gift. So what that focuses for us is like, what's at the real heart of freedom? That something be interior and that it be fixed on a true good. And God secures both of those things. So it's clarificatory, but what you really want to salvage is, the kind of freedom of exercise, freedom of specification, no lition piece. No lition, and then free to see the good in as good in one way and not good in another. And that's true. I think like just to kind of have in the back of our minds that God could have created the universe such that all free creatures freely affirmed him, right? By a gift of grace. God could have done it that way, but God did it this way. And the reason for which he did it this way is not necessarily because it's better or worse. It's just different. It's just the way God chose, right? Because it gives expression or it gives manifestation to certain excellences of the divine life. And it's not that like without it, God could not have made those things manifest. He just, in his wisdom, thought that it would be beautiful to do it this way, right? And then people think about evil, like what about the Holocaust, et cetera. And those things are not to be trifled with, as it were. While some kind of analytical theists just drill down and say like, yep, need the Holocaust in order to know how good God is. I think that's something that few people would affirm with similar conviction.
Right. Yeah. I definitely do not want to go in that direction ever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you don't want to make God dependent upon evil for the manifestation of his excellence. I think you just want to end up saying that like God made this world because he thought it beautiful, and God's plans are so excellent that they cannot be defeated by the introduction of evil, but rather in this kind of cosmic irony, God reverses the logic of evil as a way by which to manifest yet further goodness or different goodness. Okay. Yeah, that's just.
So I mean, real quick, this is why I think is helpful to get rid of like the camps or the schools and just focus on the particular things, because then we start to see that what might have seemed a superficial disagreement isn't actually a substantial one. I think that's exactly what we're seeing, because I'm saying something like a free will defense, right? So I'm not thinking like, of course, I'm not defending Molinism or trans world depravity or something like as you typically see in the literature surrounding the problem of evil. I'm saying focusing on God's ordained power and what is integral to human nature gives us the grounds for something like a free will defense that I think Thomas should embrace or should explore more. That it's something that's often overlooked a little bit, even if you can't get the same sort of. I think people look for something that just shuts off all mystery, right? That's why something like a trans world depravity account of planning, like people like that because it's very clean. I actually get a little nervous when things are too clean. I do. If something is a little too clean, I get a little nervous. But I think that there is definitely a basis when you make those distinctions between God's absolute power and ordained power, and then you probe what is integral to human nature to show why God, in the general run of things, would permit our independent failure. And that's the other part I want to explore, right? Is this line of good versus line of evil, right? So we believe in secondary causality. We believe in divine concurrence, right? And there's nothing incoherent in the statement that God causes to exist whatever there is and X freely choosing Y, just in the sense that God causes whatever to exist in the fire heating the pot, right? God is the ultimate primary cause, but there are real secondary causes in the world. So God being the cause of whatever exists in my freely choosing Y doesn't negate my freely choosing Y, for example, but it does give God, ultimately, he's the cause of all things in the line of good, we would say, all things in the cause of the line of being. This is a distinction that Maritain plays a lot on. I think it's absolutely right. But in the line of evil, this is really important for this conversation, for the problem of evil generally, because in the line of evil, the defect is entirely on the creature side, because we are not our own rule, right? It's failing to consider something that we could have considered under the divine impulse, under the divine motion. It's a non-act, a non-consideration of the rule, which at first is not a sin, because we can't consider all things all the time. We just can't, right? If I go to the bar with Father Gregory, who's a good, responsible man, but maybe I'm really excited, right? Maybe I don't consider at first handing Father Gregory my keys. Not a sin at that point, right? But if I continue not to consider that, especially if I've been habituated to know that drunk driving is bad, which I have been, and then, I'm for Pat Flynn 3 rounds in, it's enough for me, right? And then I make a judgment of saying, all right, I'm driving home. That's where I have done a positive action, which God has caused all the existence of whatever exists in that positive action, right? Where there's something missing from that. But the thing that's missing is entirely my fault in the line of evil. And so only I am responsible for that objective falsehood or that surd. And this is critically important for the problem of evil generally. And certainly it factors into the predestination question. Because we, as we talked about before, there's kind of 2 things we need to preserve. This is the delicate balance. We need to preserve divine goodness and innocence with the right expectations of that, and we need to preserve divine sovereignty, divine universal causality, this or that. And I think this critical distinction between the line of good versus the line of evil, and between the negatio, the non-consideration of certain rules, and then the judgment or the act where the consideration should have applied, but hasn't been, shows that we alone are the ones who introduce absurdity into reality. Actually, Maritain has this very clever, and I think it's more than clever, play on the famous line from the Gospels where Christ says, "Without me, you can do nothing." And, people translate that of saying, like, you just need me to do anything good. But Maritain says, no, there's a dual meaning there. He means literally without God, you can do one thing and one thing only, and that's nothing. Introduce nonsense or non-being into reality, right? That when God's creative influx comes into the free region, we can annihilate, we can non-act, non-cooperate, and introduce an objective falsehood into the world. And I think, yes, that's very clever, but I think Maritain's right. I think that is how we preserve divine innocence in there. And then, of course, we have some cleanup duty in terms of God's knowledge and simplicity there, but we can get into that. I don't think I think that can be overcome. But this ties into what's the upshot of this, right? This ties into what I'm talking about, this idea of something like a free will defense that I think Thomas should be more open to, of God respecting our fallible liberty, because that's who we are. That's just naturally who we are. And he permits that, right? He clearly permits it, even if he isn't either the direct or indirect cause of that. Do you have issues with any aspect of that account?
No. I think like the language of respecting is a language that can be equivocated upon, as it were. I'm made nervous by language that seems to ascribe relationality between or obtaining from God to us, right? So kind of classically in the Thomistic tradition, prima pars questions 44 and 45, you would talk about creation as a mixed relation. So we depend upon God, but God does not depend upon us. And so I think that like what you describe, it obtains kind of within the narrow ambit of our own thinking on the matter. But I think that when you kind of, as it were, transpose that into a divine register, that you have to purify it of some creaturely limitation. And I think that word respect, that verb especially, needs to be purified.
Right.
Because I just don't think God respects us in the way in which we envision the word respect to obtain.
So maybe this, like, in accord with his justice and wisdom, is the way I'm thinking about.
Yeah.
Is the way I'm thinking about it. Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 100%.
So I think God is consistent, and it's not just a logical consistency, like God's a good logician, but I think that, God's love is just so thoroughgoing I mean, and it's not just a matter of saying like, think about the most loving person you've ever met. Weren't they so consistent? Like now ramp that up. It's not a matter of ramping up. Okay. It just obtains on a much higher metaphysical level. But like creaturely analogies are all we have, so may as well use them. But there's a sense in which love is its own logic, right? In the sense that for the person who loves, for the pure, all things are pure. For the person who loves, all things are an expression of that love. And I think that for God, there's such a luminous clarity, such a thoroughgoing consistency to his love, that it accounts for our fallibility perfectly. And I think that from our vantage, we would call that respect of a certain sort, whether God respecting our free will or God respecting kind of the terms of his creating, right? So if God were to make a blueprint for the creation of man, set about things according to that course, come to discover within 4 hours that it had gone haywire, and then God were to do something otherwise, it would seem to suggest that there was something wrong with the original plan, which would again suggest that there is something deficient in God's wisdom. So by God setting things up and then directing the course of things as they have been set up, we see yet further testimony to the divine wisdom. So I think that respect, it's kind of gesturing towards that. But ultimately, when you try to see it contemplatively or from the top down, it's just a matter of the logic of love as applied to this particular cosmos, right? The cosmos that God actually chose.
Right. Rock on. And for people who are concerned about rock on, contingent or changing knowledge with God, I will direct you to my conversation with Chris Tomaszewski, where we defended doctrine of divine simplicity and the partial extrinsicality of knowledge. There's a lot there, but I think that this is oftentimes an unnecessary worry, even for Thomists, when it comes to contingent or changing knowledge. Once you can see that that all contingency is pushed extrinsically to God. Matthews Grant, actually, I have his book right here, has a wonderful book on this where he defends the extrinsic model of divine simplicity. I think a lot of those worries can be vanquished. It's probably too much to get into this conversation, but I have something, and this would include whatever's missing from creatures, including sin, right? Like what's not there is also part of that extrinsic grounding of knowledge as well. So we have more latitude, I guess we would say, when it comes to contingent predication, changing knowledge or stuff of God than I think people realize. And the reason I bring that up, and I know it's a somewhat subtle or technical point, is I think when people don't realize that, they make, again, mistakes in other areas that then go back and possibly impugn divine goodness or innocence. I don't know if that's something we want to explore more now or not, but yeah, it's a knotty issue. But this whole thing is a knotty issue. So I'm gonna kick it back to you, Father Gregory. What else haven't we covered in this conversation yet that you think is important to address or draw attention to?
Good question. I have meditation in 5 minutes, so maybe we could just do like final thoughts, closing thoughts, as it were.
Groovy. Yeah. Why don't you go first?
So I think for me, a big question is exemplarity. It's what I'm writing my dissertation on presently. So what does it mean for God to be our exemplar or exemplum, to use both of the Latin terms that are applied in St. Thomas? And I think that, there are a lot of things that kind of mill about our minds when we consider what it means to imitate someone or to model our lives after someone. And we brought it up in the first half of this conversation with respect to the Blessed Virgin Mary. But I think, it's helpful, it's salient to bring it up with respect to God. I think that ultimately what one imitates is being. All right, that sounds super dry, like just the type of thing that an analytic Thomist would say. I don't think that I've ever identified myself as an analytic Thomist. I don't know if I belong to a Thomistic school. If I did, I'd have to make one up. Brookland Thomism. Brookland is the name of the neighborhood.
I would need
DC.
to make one up too, for sure.
I would say I like the Thomism that I like most is the kind of Thomism of the Revue Thomiste school of 20th century France, just the guys that taught in Freiburg and Toulouse. Mm-hmm. Awesome, beautiful stuff. It's very contemplative. It's like theological. It has bite, but it's also very poetic. Okay, so in that vein, like, what does it mean to have God for our exemplar? And I think it's a matter of, like God holds before his mind's eye, as it were, the standard of our being and of our flourishing. And that causes us to be and to flourish. And it's also the term of our being and flourishing, which is to say, like, God patterns us after an ideal, which ideal takes human flesh in the Lord Jesus Christ and advances our salvation, by a campaign, as it were, whereby he conquers sin and death and drags sinful man up from the grave, right? So this is faith discourse we're talking about here. And so when it comes to predestination, or focusing the question of predestination, I think that sometimes you can get lost in the weeds of a very technical, speculative enterprise. But I think that some clarity or some light is shed on the situation by considering that Christ is the cause of our predestination, and he's also the model of our predestination. St. Thomas asked both questions back to back in the Tertia Pars. It's like question 23 or 24. So, like, what does it remain for us to do? Or how do we gain purchase on the shape of our own salvation? It's just by looking to the Lord Jesus, right? And that's not just like the kind of altar call, like dismiss the question for the sake of an impactful evangelical moment type move, right? And that serves its place as well. But like, it's just simply to say that it's taken flesh, right? So that we have confidence that this thing can be solved, as it were, or resolved at the very least, by gazing on the divinized humanity of the Lord Jesus Christ. So yeah, I think that's a helpful contextualization. Not that everyone's called to be a theologian, right? But I think everyone is called to be a saint. So that discourse has to have purchase, at least at that level.
Beautiful. Well, I know you have to jet here, so I'm not going to take up any more time with final thoughts on my end. I think we didn't get that much into Mary, but I think we at least we gave the seeds, and who knows, maybe we'll do a part 3, but we gave the seeds here that we could, maybe encourage some thought on the listener side. I've got some speculative models about Mary that I'm still working on. But what I'll do, I have this Google Doc, I just sent it to Father Gregory. I'll share that on the show notes if people want just kind of like the Pat Flynn bullet points of how I'm kind of summarizing my thoughts on predestination. But before we go, last couple minutes, Father Gregory, remind us your podcast, all the good work you're doing. Where can people go to keep up with all that stuff?
Yeah. Check out the Thomistic Institute. So Aquinas 101 just finished up the first big course of 86 videos, which walk you through the Summa. And now it's beginning a shorter course on virtue, 10 episodes that'll begin on November 24th. So check that out and sign up. You can also check out Thomistic Institute live events throughout the U.S. and beyond. And especially intellectual retreats are the move these days, because hard to meet on college campuses. It's easier to meet at retreat centers. So check those things out. And I suppose it's almost time to start applying for summer conferences. We'll publish the information on that in about 2 months. So take a look when that shows up. And then Thomistic Institute has a podcast. In addition to that podcast, Dominican Friars also have a podcast called Godsplaining. So it's myself and then 4 of my brothers. And it's 30-minute episodes once a week, conversations about all things Catholic. Cool things that we're introducing in the new year include guest-splaining. So we're going to have a guest once a month, which will be groovy. We're picking back up with Lectio Divinas for preparation for Sunday liturgies again, for penitential seasons. So that way you can suffer with us as you listen to our voice at greater frequency in penitential seasons. And those are the main things. So it's Godsplaining, Godsplaining podcast, and you can get it on any podcast app or check it out on YouTube.
Beautiful. Boom. I'll link that in the show notes as well. Father Gregory, this has been an absolute delight. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.